July 18, 1922. St. Margaret's, Westminster. More than 8,000 people packed the pavement outside to watch Lord Louis Mountbatten marry Edwina Ashley, and the crowd saw something that the British press had not seen in years, a wedding that appeared to have everything. The groom was 22, great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a dazzling naval officer who had toured Australia and India with the heir to the throne. The bride was 20, the granddaughter and principal heir of Sir Ernest Cassel, the international financier who had served as King Edward VII's closest personal banker. The Prince of Wales stood as best man. King George V and Queen Mary sat in the front pews. Mendelssohn's wedding march played as they emerged from the church. The reception was held at Brook House. The New York Times had run its announcement 4 months earlier, on March 7, 1922, under the headline, "Britain's Richest Heiress to Marry." The subhead, "Her Fortune $100 million." Contemporary newspapers dubbed it the "Wedding of the Year." A dynasty and a fortune joined at the altar before the eyes of the empire. The press wrote it as a fairy tale. What the press didn't have was the letters. They're in Southampton now. The Mountbatten papers, held at the University of Southampton's Broadlands archive, decades of correspondence between a husband and wife who documented their marriage in writing with a candor that no one who attended the 1922 wedding could have anticipated. Those papers were purchased with public funds, fought over in a 5-year legal battle by the biographer Andrew Lowney, and resisted by the Cabinet Office at an estimated cost to taxpayers of over £1 million. Lowney spent roughly £250,000 of his own money in legal fees simply to read what was already supposed to be publicly accessible. 3 major biographies, by Janet Morgan in 1991, Philip Ziegler in 1985, and Lowney in 2019, have since drawn from what the archive holds. What they confirm is that this marriage worked precisely because it wasn't a love match. It was a merger between Britain's greatest private fortune and the Crown's most ambitious fixer, run by arrangement, documented in writing, and sold to the public as the romance of the century. The Golden Couple's letters call it what it was. The gap between the 1922 headline and the archive is the territory this film occupies. To understand the merger, you have to understand what each party brought to it. Start with Edwina Ashley's side, because without it, the transaction makes no sense. Sir Ernest Cassel had been born in Cologne, Germany, the son of Jacob Cassel. By the time he died on September 21, 1921, at Brook House, Park Lane, he was among the wealthiest men in Europe. His estate was probated at approximately £6 million, roughly £250 million in today's terms, with a gross value of £7,333,411, before death duties of approximately £2.9 million were levied. He had managed the private finances of a King of England and built one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. He owned racehorses at Moulton Paddocks in Newmarket. He maintained a Swiss villa at Riederalp. He had renovated Brook House between 1905 and 1907 at vast expense, installing 24 bedrooms, 11 reception rooms, a 60-foot ballroom, a dining room seating 100 guests, and 800 tons of Tuscan marble in the main hall and staircase alone. Cassel's closest friend, King Edward VII, called him Windsor Cassel. Edwina was Cassel's principal heiress. His only child, Edwina's mother Maud, had died young, leaving 2 granddaughters on whom Cassel doted. He was particularly attached to Edwina, who had lived with him at Brook House and acted as his hostess in his final years. She was the girl who had written to him from boarding school, "Please take me away, dear Grandpa, if you love me at all." Under his will, Edwina received a life interest in a trust fund representing 25/64 of his residuary estate. The capital placed in trust for her benefit was approximately £1.6 million. This wasn't a cash gift, but a structured inheritance, the income from which, in the early marriage years, ran to approximately £60,000 per year after tax. Brook House itself passed to Edwina, subject to a life interest held by Cassel's sister Wilhelmina, which cleared upon Wilhelmina's death in 1925. The full extent of Edwina's annual income in the 1930s, her combined share with Dickie before tax, was £113,000. One of the most financially significant women in Britain by any calculation. Against that, the groom. Louis Mountbatten, Dickie to everyone who knew him, a nickname Queen Victoria herself had suggested when he was an infant at Frogmore House, was a Royal Navy lieutenant at the time of his marriage. His annual naval salary, approximately £310. Private income roughly doubled that. His total, somewhere around £620 per year. Against Edwina's £60,000, that ratio wasn't an embarrassment of modest means. It was the operating gap between two different orders of magnitude. But the financial asymmetry was only half of what Dickie brought to the marriage. The other half was a wound, and it ran deeper. Prince Louis of Battenberg, Dickie's father, had been appointed First Sea Lord on December 8, 1912, on Churchill's recommendation, with King George V's enthusiastic approval. He was the most senior officer in the Royal Navy, and he had spent decades earning it. Then the war began in August 1914, and the anti-German press campaign started. Lord Northcliffe's newspapers, principally the Daily Mail and the Times, drove a sustained campaign of xenophobic insinuation against a man who had given his professional life to British naval service. There was no credible evidence of disloyalty. It didn't matter. Churchill asked Prince Louis to resign on October 27, 1914. On October 29, 1914, Prince Louis submitted his resignation. His letter cited birth and parentage as impairing his usefulness to the Admiralty. The press coverage ran the following morning. The name change followed in the same spirit. On July 17, 1917, King George V issued a proclamation replacing prominent German royal names. The family considered various Anglicizations, including, reportedly, Battenhill, and settled on Mountbatten. Prince Louis was created Marquis of Milford Haven. The family had been reorganized once already before Dickie was old enough to understand what had been taken from it. When Prince Louis died in September 1921, less than a year before his son's wedding, his total English assets were valued at £6,535. Dickie never forgot what had happened to his father. Multiple biographers note this directly. His stated ambition, which he achieved in April 1955 when he was appointed First Sea Lord, the same office his father had been forced to abandon, was to rehabilitate the family's honor in the institution that had expelled it. That ambition required proximity to power, and proximity to power required resources. On his own salary of £310 a year, it wasn't a viable project. Edwina Ashley, with her £60,000 annual income and Brook House, and a name that commanded every door in London's society, made it viable. The New York Times headline had it as a romantic announcement. Read from the inside, it was a term sheet. The social mechanics of what followed weren't unusual in the British aristocracy of the 1920s. Arrangement marriages, unions built on the mutual conferral of status and resources, rather than romantic attachment, were operating systems. The code was understood by everyone involved. Both parties were free to pursue what they required personally, provided the public face held, the press wasn't invited in, and the staff remained loyal. What was expected above all was discretion. The language for it wasn't the language of scandal, it was the language of a household in good order. The Mountbatten marriage followed this pattern. What distinguished it was that both parties documented it. They settled into the arrangement gradually. The honeymoon was spectacular. First nights at Broadlands, then Paris, then an extended American tour in which they made a private short film with Charlie Chaplin, were received by President Warren Harding, and watched Babe Ruth play baseball. By 1926, Dickie had been posted to the flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet, and they had acquired a second house in Malta. Edwina pursued a parallel life of global travel: Mexico, Guatemala, Jerusalem, Baghdad, Tehran, the Andes, the Inca ruins at Machu Picchu. She moved at a speed that suggested, to one male admirer, that she wanted to get away from men for a while. The arrangement between them crystallized over the decade that followed. By 1929, per Andrew Lowney's reconstruction, it had been effectively decided that Edwina was free to pursue her romances provided she was discreet. By 1932, Dickie had taken Yola Letellier, a Frenchwoman, as a long-term mistress. The arrangement was bilateral. Two spouses, each with a principal parallel attachment, the whole structure running on mutual understanding and a shared commitment to the public marriage's surface integrity. Their daughter, Pamela Hicks, in her memoir Daughter of Empire, described what her parents negotiated as a modus vivendi. Using their reserves of deep mutual affection, my parents managed to negotiate a way through this crisis and found a modus vivendi. That Latin phrase, a way of life, is the most precisely calibrated description available of what the correspondence confirms. She also described the household's composition with unsentimental accuracy. Her parents, each with their primary companion, the two couples forming what she called a rather eccentric family. Harold "Bunny" Phillips, a Coldstream Guards officer who met Edwina in the early 1930s, was, by Pamela Hicks's account, a core part of my rather eccentric family, often living with the household, befriending both daughters, a near-permanent domestic presence. The Bunny Phillips relationship was the most emotionally significant of Edwina's extramarital attachments. It ran for roughly a decade, until October 10, 1944, when Phillips married Georgina Werner at St. Margaret's, Westminster, the same church where Edwina had married Dickie 22 years earlier. It reportedly took Edwina 2 years to recover. None of this was hidden from Dickie. The Washington Post's 1991 review of Janet Morgan's authorized biography summarized the terms the letters established. They would stay together, keep separate beds, remain loving, mutually supportive chums, and above all, be discreet. Morgan had read both sides of their correspondence before she wrote that. She was describing a documented arrangement. One letter Lowney cites from Dickie to Edwina cuts through decades of interpretation in a single sentence. Mountbatten wrote to his wife, "I wish I knew how to flirt with other women, and especially with my wife." A man who could write that to his wife had taken the full measure of what he had, and had not, built. He understood the asymmetry. He named it. He posted it to her. The remark that has circulated most widely, that Mountbatten once acknowledged he and Edwina had spent their married life getting into other people's beds, reached the public through Philip Ziegler's official 1985 biography rather than through a surviving private letter between them. Ziegler had privileged access to Mountbatten's papers. Whether the line was an oral remark, a diary entry, or something else in the archive, the available sourcing presents it as a spoken acknowledgement, not an extracted letter text. The biographers who followed, including Lowney, repeated it. The substance, across every account, is consistent. Both parties lived the arrangement openly, by shared understanding, for decades. The line's provenance is a detail. The fact it describes isn't. The correspondence that does survive in authenticated form is already extraordinary enough for the argument. There are the letters about Nehru, written between Edwina and Dickie from approximately 1952 onward, in which Mountbatten acknowledged to his wife that he knew and had always understood the very special relationship between Jawaharlal and her. He knew. He acknowledged it, in writing, to her. The man the newspapers had photographed emerging from St. Margaret's in 1922 as the hero of a fairy tale wrote his wife explicit acknowledgments of her relationship with another man, and meant those acknowledgments as expressions of affection. If you have seen our earlier film on Prince Philip, the film that built its center on the question of the boy whose family collapsed while the royal system watched, you already know one part of what the Mountbatten household became. The description offered there, that the Mountbattens were the only stable adult presence in the life of the boy whose immediate family had just collapsed. Here is what that family collapse actually looked like. Princess Alice of Battenberg, Philip's mother, Dickie's older sister, was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1930 and committed to a sanatorium in Switzerland, where her treatment included procedures overseen in consultation with Sigmund Freud. Her husband, Prince Andrew of Greece, had already been sent into exile following Greece's military catastrophe. By 1930 and 1931, the family fell completely apart. Prince Andrew separated from his wife and Philip and went to live on the Riviera, eventually settling permanently in Monaco with his companion. He died in Monte Carlo in 1944. 4 of Philip's sisters had married German princes. Philip was 9 years old when his immediate household dissolved. The structure that received him was the Mountbatten structure. Dickie's mentorship of Philip was deliberate, sustained, and career-shaping. The connection to Gordonston, where Philip eventually became head of school and captain of hockey and cricket, ran through the Mountbatten orbit. The Routledge chapter on Mountbatten describes the mentorship of Philip as perhaps the most enduringly significant aspect of his legacy. The structural irony is exact. The marriage that produced the most unconventional household arrangement in the royal adjacent world, 2 spouses, each with long-term parallel attachments, the whole structure running on documented mutual honesty rather than romantic obligation, became the most reliably stable home available to a future Duke of Edinburgh whose own parents' marriage had completely disintegrated. Edwina's money built the households. Dickie's ambition structured them. Both parties had freed themselves from romantic performance, and the result was a household that functioned. The fixers' marriage fixed things. In February 1947, Prime Minister Clement Attlee appointed Viscount Mountbatten as the last Viceroy of India, with a mandate to complete the transfer of power by June 1948. Mountbatten arrived in New Delhi on March 22, 1947, with Edwina beside him. His 3 June plan for partition was announced publicly on June 3. Pakistan became independent on August 14, 1947. India on August 15. The Radcliffe Line, the boundary between the 2 new nations, was published on August 17, 2 days after independence, contributing to the chaos that followed. The accelerated timeline is a matter of historical controversy. Mountbatten advanced the transfer date by approximately 10 months from the original June 1948 deadline. Many historians argue that compression exacerbated the disorder. Approximately 15 million people were displaced. Estimates of those killed range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million. The haste is widely seen among historians as an aggravating factor in one of the 20th century's worst humanitarian catastrophes. Into that catastrophe stepped Edwina, as Vicereine and then as Countess Mountbatten of Burma. She organized and directed large-scale relief operations throughout the partition period, visiting camps, hospitals, and refugee convoys across northern India and Pakistan through July and August 1947. She had been Superintendent-in-Chief of the St. John Ambulance Brigade since 1942, 18 years in that role in total. During the Partition crisis, she united 15 relief organizations under the banner of the United Council of Relief and Welfare. She coordinated cholera vaccinations and sanitation for displaced people. Her ADCs reportedly became reluctant to accompany her on field visits because she would stop in areas of active sniping to personally carry wounded to hospital. One journalist described her going, "among the poor and the sick and the suffering, like some latter-day Mary Magdalene." Another wrote of her, "squatting in the midst of the dirty and diseased, taking their soiled and trembling hands in hers." Janet Morgan's authorized biography, published in 1991 with full access to the family archive, is titled Edwina Mountbatten, A Life of Her Own. That title isn't decorative. The myth correction of this script only holds its weight if Edwina is first permitted to be what the record actually shows she was: one of the most operationally effective public figures Britain produced in the 20th century. To reduce her to the romantic drama, the affair with Nehru, the open marriage, is to replicate the same diminishment the press performed when they photographed her coming out of St. Margaret's in 1922 and called it a fairy tale. She was more than her marriage. The letters prove that too. Her friendship with Jawaharlal Nehru began in this period. They had briefly met in Singapore in 1946. Their second meeting was on March 22, 1947, the day she and Dickie landed at Palam Airport to begin the viceroyalty. Nehru wrote of what developed between them. "Life is a dreary business, and when a bright patch comes, it rather takes one's breath away." He described the force drawing them together as some uncontrollable force. The correspondence that followed ran from 1947 until Edwina's death in 1960. Hundreds of letters, written with a frequency that declined from daily to weekly over the years. The letters are among the most contested documents in modern British history. Nehru's letters to Edwina are currently inaccessible. Edwina's letters to Nehru are held in the Broadlands Archive at Southampton, under private ownership by Lord Brabourne, a Mountbatten heir, and exempt from Freedom of Information requests. A UK information tribunal confirmed the University of Southampton does not own these letters. It holds them on behalf of the family. The university was reportedly offered an option to purchase the Edwina Nehru letters for £100. It didn't exercise it. The biographers who have seen portions of the correspondence divide on what it proves. Janet Morgan was the first biographer to read both sides of the Edwina Nehru correspondence before writing her 1991 biography. Her conclusion: Nehru was the great love of Edwina's life, the relationship operating on a higher and more satisfying plane than her earlier affairs, but ultimately purer than a physical relationship. She argued Nehru respected Mountbatten and wouldn't have abused that trust by sleeping with his wife under his own roof. Alex von Tunzelmann, in Indian Summer, her 2007 account of the viceroyalty years, confirmed that Nehru and Edwina had fallen in love with each other, and quoted Nehru's description of some uncontrollable force. On the physical question, she was precise. As to whether it was also physical, there is, of course, no evidence. She noted that researchers had seen only a small number of the letters, but that those letters emphatically confirm a profound love. Andrew Lowney, in the Mountbattens, took a more assertive position. He argued the physical relationship probably began in May 1948, shortly before the Mountbattens left India, citing Richard Hough's claim that Mountbatten knew they were lovers and was proud of it. Pamela Hicks, who read Nehru's letters to her mother, became convinced the relationship wasn't physical. She cited practical constraints. They were rarely alone and always surrounded by staff, police, and other people. And Nehru's honor. He wouldn't have betrayed a friend by sleeping with his wife in his own house. She also noted that her father's attitude wasn't one of jealousy. Edwina's happiness with Nehru came, in Dickie's view, as something of a relief. He would sometimes have to go out of the room to give them time together. Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi denied a sexual affair. So did his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit. His niece, Nayantara Sahgal, called the idea more absurd than ridiculous. The dominant position among careful historians is that the deep mutual love is confirmed, and the physical consummation is unproven and probably unknowable, because the letters are sealed. Lowney's assertive position rests on testimonial evidence rather than archival disclosure. The debate isn't evenly weighted. It's cautious historians on one side and a minority assertive position on the other, and the letters that would settle it remain inaccessible. What isn't in dispute? When Edwina died, Nehru ordered the Indian Navy frigate INS Trishul, then in port for repairs, to escort HMS Wakeful on its burial voyage and scatter marigolds on the waves. A prime minister of an independent nation dispatching a warship in formal public mourning for a woman. That isn't the gesture of a man who had shared a diplomatic friendship with an official's wife. It's the most visible proof of what the sealed letters hold. Edwina died on February 21, 1960, in Jesselton, now Kota Kinabalu, the capital of the Crown Colony of North Borneo. She was on an inspection tour for the St. John Ambulance Brigade. She died in her sleep at the house of Robert Noel Turner, the acting governor. She was 58 years old. A heart specialist had warned her in 1957 that her cardiac condition was poor and she should reduce her workload and travel. She had suffered a small stroke in 1958. She had contracted a severe case of chickenpox from a grandchild that same year and never fully recovered. None of it slowed her. The 1960 Far East tour took her through Cyprus, Karachi, Delhi, Malaya, Singapore, and then North Borneo. Inspection upon inspection, for an organization she had led for nearly 2 decades. In Delhi, on this final circuit, she had spent several days with Nehru, who noticed how ill and strange she looked. He made no mention of it. He understood her need to keep working. Letters from Nehru were reportedly found by her bed in Jesselton. The call reached Dickie at 3 in the morning. He flew through the night to reach her. He arrived too late. Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, officiated at her burial at sea from HMS Wakeful on February 25, 1960, off the coast of Portsmouth. Then, as Pamela Hicks described it, the Indian frigate INS Trishul quietly took our place, and, on Panditji's instructions, marigolds were scattered upon the waves. After Edwina's death, Dickie kept her letters. He referred to the Nehru correspondence as the love letters, and told people they would ultimately be published. Her gross personal estate was valued at £589,655, vastly reduced from the peak of the Cassel income by decades of taxation, expenditure, and the post-war destruction of large fortunes. Death duties took £333,153 of that. Dickie reportedly complained to friends that his net inheritance from his wife's estate amounted to roughly 1 shilling in the pound. He kept the letters anyway. Now assemble the architecture of what this script has built. Edwina Ashley walked into St. Margaret's, Westminster, on July 18, 1922, as the bearer of a fortune valued by the contemporary press at $100 million, the beneficiary of Sir Ernest Cassel's trust, with a post-tax annual income that dwarfed her groom's salary by a factor of roughly 100. Heir to Brook House's 800 tons of Tuscan marble and its 60-foot ballroom, and possessor of a social weight that made her one of the most powerful figures in London society before she was 21. Louis Mountbatten walked in as the great-grandson of Queen Victoria, the son of a man publicly humiliated and stripped of the highest naval office in Britain, bearer of a surname that was itself a wartime reorganization, the anglicized survival form of Battenberg, adopted on July 17, 1917, under explicit royal pressure. He owned a naval salary of £310 per year and a proximity to the throne that no amount of money could manufacture. His father had left English assets of £6,535. He brought what he had. She brought what she had. Together, they negotiated an operating agreement that both parties honored for 38 years. The arrangement didn't emerge complete on the wedding day. The marriage began conventionally, and the open understanding crystallized gradually over the decade between 1922 and 1932. But both parties eventually documented it honestly, in private writing, to each other. Mountbatten wrote to his wife that he wished he knew how to flirt, especially with my wife, and then acknowledged, years later and in writing, that he had always understood the very special relationship between Jawaharlal and you. Pamela Hicks called what her parents built a modus vivendi. The Washington Post's review of Morgan's authorized biography described the terms as mutual support, separate beds, discretion above all. That arrangement housed the most powerful double act at the end of the British Empire. At the Viceroyalty, where Edwina directed mass-scale humanitarian operations across a partition crisis that displaced 15 million people, while Dickie managed the transfer of power to two new nations, the merger operated at maximum capacity. Two people who had freed each other from romantic obligation, functioning as a high-performing public partnership precisely because the private terms were clear. And then the structural irony. That same merger, unconventional by every social measure, became the most conventionally reliable domestic structure available to a future Duke of Edinburgh, whose own family had dissolved entirely. Princess Alice in a Swiss sanatorium, Prince Andrew in Monaco with his companion. The Mountbatten household the only one standing. The myth required a golden couple. The letters delivered something harder to narrate and more durable than the myth could have contained. Why did the fairy tale version survive? Because it needed to. The house required one couple whose story could be handed to the press without footnotes, who would photograph well on the steps of St. Margaret's, whose marriage would stand as proof that romance and dynasty could coexist, whose image would keep the institution legible to a public that was always more comfortable with fairy tales than with term sheets. The letters were easier to admire from a distance than to read up close. What the Broadlands archive holds, across those thousands of files purchased with public funds, contested in court, digitized at Southampton, still partially sealed and partially suppressed, is the most honest documentary record any marriage in the royal orbit of the 20th century left behind. Not because the couple loved each other in the way the newspapers promised, because they told each other the truth in writing for 38 years, and they kept it. Edwina died in Borneo still working. Dickie flew through the night to reach her. He kept her letters for the rest of his life. The INS Trishul scattered marigolds at her burial at sea. Whatever it wasn't nothing. It wasn't the fairy tale. It was something the newspapers could never have sold, and something both of them, by the record, chose anyway. If stories that the official version preferred you not read this carefully are what you're here for, subscribe.